Arrogance is a dangerous game, especially at a restricted tactical range, when three cocky corporate mercenaries tried to bully a quiet, unassuming woman off her shooting bench. They expected an easy surrender. 45 seconds later, their careers were erased by the icy precision of a verified Navy SEAL sniper. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth of the Ocotillo High Desert Tactical Facility. Heat waves shimmered off the 1,500-yard shooting range, distorting the steel silhouettes positioned at varying, agonizing distances. The air smelled of baked dust, sagebrush, and the sharp, metallic tang of spent brass. This wasn't a public range. Ocotillo was a privately leased federal facility, a place where elite military units, federal tactical teams, and top-tier private defense contractors came to hone the bleeding edge of their lethal trades. It was a place where egos were as heavily armored as the personnel. Sitting alone at bench 4 was Jessica Cole. She didn't look like the kind of person who belonged at Ocotillo. Dressed in faded olive-drab cargo pants, a plain grey moisture-wicking t-shirt, and a scuffed tan baseball cap pulled low over her aviator sunglasses. She looked more like a lost hiker or an off-duty administrative assistant than a tactical operator. She sat completely motionless, her breathing slow and measured, her attention entirely consumed by the large, weather-beaten Pelican case resting on the wooden bench in front of her. Inside the case rested a heavily modified Mark 13 Mod 7 sniper rifle, chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum. It was a weapon designed for surgical lethality at extreme distances. Jessica ran a lightly oiled cloth over the bolt carrier group with the quiet, reverent precision of a surgeon prepping a scalpel. Down the gravel path, the crunch of heavy boots announced the arrival of the afternoon's problem. Brad Miller, Tyler Evans, and Derek Thompson walked with the exaggerated, wide-shouldered swagger of men who had recently been handed a sliver of authority and believed they were gods among men. All three were fresh graduates of the grueling selection course for Aegis International, one of the most lucrative and cutthroat private military corporations in the world. They had spent the last 8 weeks shooting, running, and screaming their way to the top of their class. They were young, highly athletic, and brimming with the kind of toxic confidence that only comes from never having faced a truly superior adversary. Brad, a former Division I linebacker who looked like he ate gravel for breakfast, was the undisputed alpha of the trio. Tyler was the slick-talking son of a wealthy corporate executive, a guy who bought $15,000 custom gear to mask his average marksmanship. Derek was the shadow, the sycophant who laughed at Brad's jokes and backed up Tyler's insults. They dropped their heavy gear bags onto benches 1, 2, and 3. Brad stretched his massive shoulders, cracking his neck loudly as he surveyed the range. That's when his eyes landed on bench 4. He paused, a smirk slowly spreading across his heavily tanned face. "Hey, look what we got here," Brad muttered, nudging Tyler. "Did the admin office schedule a field trip?" Tyler chuckled, leaning against his bench and crossing his arms. "Looks like someone's girlfriend got lost looking for the visitor center. Should we point her back to the highway before the range goes hot?" Jessica heard them. Of course. Her hearing, trained by years of hypervigilance in active war zones, picked up the subtle crunch of their boots long before they spoke. But she didn't react. She didn't flinch. She simply continued her methodical maintenance, sliding the heavy steel bolt back into the receiver of the Mark 13 with a satisfying, metallic clack. To Jessica, men like Brad, Tyler, and Derek were white noise. She had spent the last decade of her life in the United States Navy, shattering every glass ceiling the military had to offer. She hadn't just survived a BUD/S basic underwater demolition/SEAL training. She had conquered it, enduring the freezing surf of Coronado, the sleep-deprived hallucinations of Hell Week, and the crushing weight of the logs, all while carrying the unbearable scrutiny of being one of the first women to attempt it. She had earned her trident in blood, sweat, and fractured bones. She had then gone on to SEAL sniper school, mastering the mathematics of death. She had 82 confirmed kills across 3 continents. She didn't need to prove herself to 3 rent-a-cops. But her silence only fueled their arrogance. Brad, feeling his authority challenged by her mere indifference, unhooked his sunglasses and walked over to bench 4. He leaned heavily against the wooden partition, invading her personal space. "Hey, sweetheart," Brad said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Ear protection is mandatory on the firing line. And honestly, you shouldn't be playing with the big boy toys. The recoil on a rifle that size will snap your collarbone. Why don't you pack it up before you hurt yourself?" Jessica didn't look up. She meticulously adjusted the windage dial on her Night Force scope, the tiny clicks barely audible over the desert wind. "I said." Brad leaned closer, his voice dropping an octave into what he thought was a commanding growl. "Pack it up. This range is reserved for Aegis contractors for the next 2 hours. Real operators. We don't have time to babysit tourists." Jessica finally paused. She placed her hands flat on the bench on either side of the rifle. She took a slow, deep breath, holding it for 2 seconds before exhaling. It was a combat breathing technique designed to lower the heart rate. Not out of fear, but out of a desperate attempt to suppress the overwhelming urge to dismantle the man standing next to her. "The range schedule," Jessica said, her voice eerily calm, smooth, and utterly devoid of emotion, "states that Bench 4 is reserved for federal personnel until 1600 hours. You have benches 1 through 3. I suggest you go use them." Tyler, walking up behind Brad, let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Federal personnel. What, are you with the Postal Service? Or maybe the Department of Agriculture?" "Listen to her. Brad, she thinks she's a Fed," Derek chimed in from the back. "Come on, lady. Just give us the bench. Brad here just shot a masterclass qualifier. We need the extra space to run our transitional drills. Don't make this difficult." "I'm not making it difficult," Jessica replied, finally turning her head. She didn't take off her aviator sunglasses, denying them the satisfaction of eye contact. "I'm stating a fact. Now, step away from my bench." Brad's face flushed red beneath his tan. He was used to civilians deferring to him. He was used to his size and his tactical gear doing the talking for him. Being dismissed by a woman half his size, who was dressed like a soccer mom on a hiking trip, felt like a physical slap to his ego. "Listen to me, little girl," Brad snarled, dropping the faux politeness. "I don't know whose gear you're babysitting, but you are out of your depth. I'm giving you one last warning to close that case and take a walk." High above them, in the air-conditioned, glass-enclosed range control tower, Chief Petty Officer Thomas Reed watched the interaction through a pair of high-powered Swarovski binoculars. Reed was a seasoned range master and a retired SEAL himself. He had served with Jessica in the dust and blood of a classified deployment in Syria 4 years prior. He had seen her sit motionless in a bombed-out minaret for 52 hours straight, waiting for a single, critical shot that saved a pinned-down Marine squad. The junior range officer beside Reed reached for the PA system microphone. "Sir, looks like the Aegis contractors are giving the shooter on bench 4 some trouble. Should I tell them to back off?" Reed chuckled, a low, rumbling sound in his chest. He gently placed his hand over the junior officer's wrist, pushing the microphone away. "No." Reed smiled, his eyes glued to the binoculars. "Leave the comms off. This is about to be the most educational experience those 3 boys have ever had in their entire miserable lives." The wind shifted, kicking up a small cloud of red dust that swirled around bench 4. The tension on the firing line was palpable, thick enough to cut with a combat knife. Brad stood towering over Jessica, his jaw locked in a rigid line. Behind him, Tyler and Derek had stepped closer, forming a physical wall. It was a classic intimidation tactic pack mentality, designed to trigger a flight response in a weaker target. But Jessica's heart rate remained at a steady, resting 55 beats per minute. When words failed to move her, Tyler decided to escalate. He let out an exasperated sigh, stepped around Brad, and reached out with his thick, gloved hand toward the open Pelican case. "All right. Clearly you don't speak English. We'll help you pack." He expected to simply slam the lid shut. What happened next occurred faster than his brain could process. Before Tyler's fingers could even brush the black polymer of the case, Jessica's right hand snapped out like a striking viper. She didn't grab his hand. She bypassed it entirely, her fingers locking onto the pressure points surrounding the ulnar nerve on the inside of Tyler's wrist. With a sharp, precise twist and a downward yank that utilized her core and the leverage of the bench, she immobilized him. Tyler let out a sharp, breathless gasp as a line of white-hot agony shot up his arm, radiating straight into his armpit. His knees buckled instantly, his body instinctively dropping to alleviate the excruciating pressure on his nerve. He slammed into the wooden bench, his face contorted in shock and pain. Jessica hadn't even stood up. She remained seated, her grip like a steel vice, her aviators still perfectly leveled at Brad. "Do not," Jessica said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute whisper that cut through the desert wind. "Ever touch my gear again? Do you understand me?" Brad took a stunned step back, his hand reflexively dropping toward the sidearm holstered on his hip before his brain caught up with the reality of the situation. Derek's jaw dropped. The speed and sheer mechanical violence of the countermove defied everything they thought they knew about the woman sitting in front of them. Jessica released Tyler's wrist with a flick of her hand. Tyler stumbled backward, clutching his arm, his chest heaving. "Crazy. She's crazy," he stammered, rubbing the rapidly bruising skin. Brad's shock quickly morphed into explosive rage. His authority had just been physically dismantled in front of his crew. He couldn't let it stand. He stepped aggressively into Jessica's space, his chest puffed out. "You think you're pretty tough with a cheap parlor trick," Brad spat, pointing a thick finger at her face. "You think because you know a little Krav Maga, you belong on this line with us? You're a joke. You're a tourist playing dress-up." Jessica slowly took off her aviator sunglasses, folding them and setting them meticulously next to her rifle. For the first time, Brad looked directly into her eyes. They were cold, flat, and hollow, the eyes of someone who had looked through optics at things that would give a normal man nightmares for the rest of his life. For a fleeting second, a primal alarm bell rang in the back of Brad's mind, telling him to back down. But his ego silenced it. "I don't play," Jessica said simply. Brad scoffed, looking back at Derek and Tyler to ensure he still had his audience. Prove it. You want bench 4. You want to act like a Tier 1 operator. Prove you can even shoot that cannon. Brad pointed downrange, toward the shimmering heat distortion. 3 targets. Cold bore. We have steel at 400 yards, 800 yards, and a 12-inch plate at 1,200 yards. The wind is currently blowing a half value, left to right at 12 miles per hour. Brad pulled a heavy digital stopwatch from his tactical vest. You have 45 seconds, Brad challenged, his voice dripping with venom. 45 seconds to get in position, load, acquire, and hit all 3, from a cold start. If you miss even one, you pack your bags, you walk off this range, and you leave the tactical stuff to the professionals. Tyler, regaining his composure and nursing his wrist, sneered. And what if she can't even lift the gun? If I hit them, Jessica interrupted, her voice cutting through their laughter like shattered glass. Brad laughed. If you hit them, I'll personally carry your bags to your car, and we'll walk off the range ourselves. No, Jessica said, standing up. She wasn't tall, but the way she carried herself suddenly made her seem colossal. If I hit them within 45 seconds, you 3 march up to the administrative office. You tear up your newly minted Aegis contracts, and you never step foot on a federal tactical range again, because men who lack the situational awareness to identify the apex predator in the room have no business carrying a gun in a combat zone. The silence that followed was absolute. The sheer weight of her ultimatum, delivered without a single trace of bluff or hesitation, hit the 3 men like a physical blow. Derek looked nervously at Brad. Tyler stopped rubbing his wrist. Brad swallowed hard, but he had backed himself into a corner. There was no way a civilian, let alone a woman who looked like she spent her weekends at a farmer's market, could make 3 complex long-range shots with varying wind calls in under a minute. It was a sniper's nightmare drill. It was impossible. Deal! Brad snarled, raising the stopwatch. Get on the gun. Up in the tower. Chief Reed leaned forward, resting his elbows on the glass. He reached over and flipped the switch for the external range speakers, wanting every soul within a mile to hear the ping of the steel. Here we go, Reed whispered to himself, a broad grin spreading across his weathered face. Jessica didn't rush. She moved with terrifying, fluid efficiency. She stepped behind the Mark 13 Mod 7. She didn't drop onto the bench. She folded into it, her body melding perfectly with the stock of the rifle. She pulled the bipod legs down, seating them firmly into the wood. She racked the bolt back, smoothly chambering a massive point, 300 Win Mag round, the brass gleaming in the sunlight. She pressed her cheek against the stock, her eye perfectly aligning with the Night Force optic. She didn't look at the wind flags. She could feel the wind on the exposed skin of her neck. She could see the dust moving through the mirage. Her brain, wired by years of intense stress inoculation, instantly calculated the ballistic drop and the wind deflection. She slowed her breathing. Inhale for 4, hold for 4. Brad watched her posture change, the way she locked into the rifle. It wasn't the sloppy, nervous stance of an amateur. It was the rigid, locked-in biomechanics of a machine. That primal alarm bell in his head started screaming. Timer starts. Now! Brad yelled, clicking the stopwatch. 45 seconds. Timer starts. Now! Brad yelled, his thumb jamming down on the plastic button of the stopwatch. 45 seconds. In a gunfight, 45 seconds is an eternity. It is enough time for an entire squad to be wiped out, or for a seasoned operator to change the course of a battle. To Jessica Cole, 45 seconds was a luxury. 0 seconds. Jessica's mind cleared, entirely severing itself from the 3 men standing behind her. The anger, the annoyance, it all evaporated, replaced by the icy, calculating void she had cultivated over a decade of combat deployments. She was no longer a woman sitting on a wooden bench. She was a biological extension of the Mark 13 Mod 7 rifle. 3 seconds. She didn't touch the windage dials. Dialing took time, and time was the only currency she was spending right now. She would use the mil-dot reticle etched into the glass of her Night Force Atakar, 5 to 25 times 56 scope for holdovers. Target 1, 400 yards, a standard IPSC steel silhouette. At this distance, the .300 Winchester Magnum bullet was traveling so fast its trajectory was essentially a laser beam. The 12-mile-per-hour wind from the left would only push the heavy 220-grain Sierra Match King bullet a fraction of an inch. She placed the center crosshair dead center on the steel chest plate. 5 seconds. Jessica exhaled, letting her lungs empty naturally until she hit her respiratory pause, that fraction of a second where the body is completely still. Her finger pressed the 2.5-pound trigger straight to the rear. Crack, boom. The massive rifle roared, the muzzle brake venting high-pressure gas violently to the sides, kicking up a furious cloud of red desert dust that washed over Brad, Tyler, and Derek. Before the sound of the gunshot had even finished echoing off the distant canyon walls, a sharp, metallic ping rang back across the desert. Center mass. Perfect hit. Brad blinked, coughing slightly on the gunpowder-laced dust. He looked down at his watch. 8 seconds. Jessica hadn't even lifted her head. The recoil had pushed straight back into her shoulder, her perfectly aligned body absorbing the shock and dropping the crosshairs right back onto the target line. With a flick of her wrist, she cycled the heavy steel bolt. The spent brass casing ejected in a gleaming arc, landing near Brad's boot, while a fresh round was shoved into the chamber. Target 2, 800 yards. Now physics entered the equation. The air density, the barometric pressure of the high desert, and the wind were no longer negligible. The heat mirage off the desert floor was boiling, making the steel plate appear to dance and shimmer in the glass. 12 seconds. Jessica tracked the target. At 800 yards, the bullet would drop over 100 inches. The wind, sweeping across the open expanse, would push it almost 3 feet to the right. She read the mirage, noting the angle of the shimmering waves. She shifted her aim, placing the target in the lower right quadrant of her reticle, utilizing the mil-dots to calculate the precise hold. 15 seconds. She didn't hesitate. She didn't second-guess the math. Respiratory pause, squeeze, crack, boom. The recoil slammed into her, but her eye remained glued to the optic. Flight time for the bullet at this distance was nearly a full second. Through the scope, she watched the visible ripple in the air, caused by the bullet displacing the atmosphere at supersonic speed, arc perfectly into the center of the shimmering steel. Ping! The sound was fainter this time, delayed by the distance, but the distinct, resonant chime of lead-striking AR-500 steel was undeniable. Tyler swallowed audibly, the sound loud in the sudden silence of the firing line. The smug smirk was entirely gone from his face, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed expression of dawning horror. Derek took a slow, unconscious step backward. Brad stared at the stopwatch. 19 seconds. He felt a cold sweat prickle at the base of his neck. This wasn't lucky shooting. This was clinical, mechanical perfection. The speed with which she transitioned, acquired, calculated, and fired was something he had only ever seen in instructional videos produced by Tier 1 military units. She's holding over, Derek whispered, his voice trembling. She didn't even touch her dials for the 800. Who does that with a .300 Win Mag on a cold bore? Shut up, Brad hissed, but his voice lacked its previous venom. It sounded thin, fragile. Target 3, 1,200 yards. This wasn't a silhouette. This was a 12-inch circular steel plate at over 2/3 of a mile away. It looked like a grey pinhead through the boiling desert mirage. At this distance, the bullet would go transonic, dropping below the speed of sound, making its flight path unstable and unpredictable. The wind was no longer a constant. It was a complex series of different currents crossing the jagged terrain. 24 seconds. Jessica cycled the bolt again. The final round slid into battery. She paused. The wind flags at the 500-yard mark were suddenly limp, while the dust near the target at 1,200 yards was whipping aggressively to the left. A crosswind, the hardest condition to shoot in. 28 seconds. She's stuck, Tyler muttered, desperately hoping for a failure. The wind shifted. She lost her read. Jessica hadn't lost anything. She was waiting. She watched a tumbleweed break loose near the 1,000-yard berm. She counted the seconds it took to cross her field of view, calculating the velocity of the gust downrange. 32 seconds. The gust died down, leaving a momentary 3-second window of clean air. Jessica shifted her entire body slightly, readjusting her natural point of aim. She placed the reticle high and to the left, holding over nearly 20 feet above the actual target to account for the massive ballistic drop. 35 seconds. Exhale. Pause. The world narrowed to the space between her heartbeat. Squeeze. Crack boom. The final shot echoed with a thunderous finality. Jessica didn't immediately cycle the bolt. She stayed locked in, staring through the scope, watching the bullet's trace arc high into the sky, fighting the atmosphere, fighting gravity, fighting the wind, before plunging down toward the tiny grey circle. 1 second. 2 seconds. Brad held his breath, staring down the range, praying to any god that would listen that she missed. If she missed, his fragile ego could survive. If she missed, his career was safe. Ping! It was barely a whisper of a sound, a faint, tiny chime that carried across the 1,200 yards of sun-baked earth. But they all heard it. Through the spotting scope Brad had set up on bench 1, he could clearly see a fresh, silver splash of lead dead center on the 12-inch plate. Jessica slowly lifted her head from the rifle. She reached up, grabbed her aviator sunglasses, and slid them back over her eyes. Only then did she turn to look at Brad. "Time?" she asked softly. Brad stared down at the digital display in his trembling hand. Silence settled over the Ocotillo firing line, thick and suffocating, heavier than the desert heat itself. Brad, Tyler, and Derek stood frozen, their earlier arrogance shattered beyond repair. The reality of what they had just witnessed and who they had just confronted pressed down on them like a crushing weight. Jessica didn't react. She cleared her rifle with calm precision, locking the bolt back as if nothing unusual had happened. No smirk, no victory, just quiet. Practiced efficiency. "You just got lucky," Brad muttered weakly, his voice betraying him. Before Jessica could answer, the sharp screech of tires cut through the stillness. A tactical cart rolled to a stop behind them. Chief Reed stepped out, followed by a sharply dressed man in a black polo, David Sterling, the regional director. The energy shifted instantly. Sterling walked straight past the three men, ignoring their rigid salutes. He stopped in front of Jessica and gave a crisp, respectful nod. "Outstanding shooting, Chief," he said evenly. That was exceptional. The words hit harder than any insult. Reed joined him, casually reinforcing what the men now feared. Jessica wasn't just good. She was elite, DevGru level, the kind of operator they had no right even speaking to, let alone challenging. Brad's composure crumbled. "Sir, there's been a misunderstanding. There hasn't." Sterling cut in coldly. "I heard everything." The color drained from their faces. Sterling stepped closer, his voice dropping to something far more dangerous than anger. "You thought you were intimidating a civilian. Instead, you embarrassed yourselves in front of the one person evaluating whether this company keeps its federal contract." The words landed like a death sentence. Jessica closed her case, lifting it effortlessly. Then she turned, her mirrored lenses reflecting their fear. "I gave you a chance to walk away," she said calmly. "You chose ego instead of awareness. That's not just unprofessional, it's dangerous." She paused briefly. "In the field, that mistake gets people killed." No one spoke. "My evaluation is complete," she continued, glancing at Sterling. "Your team lacks the discipline required for integration. I can't recommend approval." Tyler stepped forward. "Desperate. Please, we worked for this. You can't end everything over a few minutes." "I didn't," Jessica replied. "You did." The finality in her voice left no room for argument. She walked away without another word, boots crunching against gravel as she headed toward her vehicle. Sterling watched her go, then turned back, his expression merciless. "Pack your gear," he ordered. "Your contracts are terminated." The three men stood there, surrounded by expensive equipment that now meant nothing. In the distance, Jessica's SUV disappeared into the heat haze, leaving behind only silence and the echo of a lesson they would never forget. The legend of Bench 4 spread through the private military contracting world like wildfire. Brad, Tyler, and Derek became cautionary tales, their careers permanently blacklisted across the industry. As for Jessica Cole, she simply returned to her quiet routine, her identity hidden behind aviator sunglasses and a calm demeanor. She remained the deadliest person in the room, and the entire tactical community now knew better than to test her. Did Jessica's icy composure and legendary 45-second takedown give you chills? That is exactly why you never judge a book by its cover, especially when that cover belongs to a verified Navy SEAL sniper. If you love